and welcome to King's College Cambridge and the podcast Kings of Curiosity. We're here to take you down a road of discovery as we talk to some of the brightest minds in Britain today to understand what they're doing and why their ideas could help us understand our world more clearly and even make it a better place. I'm your host, Gillian, and I serve as Provost of King's College Cambridge. And I took the role because I wanted to champion the next generation of students and researchers. Our thinkers, scientists, artists and writers are national treasures, and we should be celebrating them, supporting them, and yes, of course, funding them if we want to imagine a better future. Now, I'm not actually one of those researchers myself, but I was an anthropologist before I became a journalist. I did field work in Tajikistan, in fact, then Soviet Tajikistan, and I spent time in Tibet and Pakistan, and there I learned all about the ancient Silk Roads. That is an extraordinary place with amazing history. Now, some of you might think about the Silk Roads and imagine caravans and camels and Genghis Khan and things like that, and wonder, why do we need to know about all of this? But in fact, the idea of the Silk Roads is really important because how we understand our past can inform our present. And at King's, we have an amazing group of researchers, from historians to anthropologists to archaeologists and more, all of whom are looking at different aspects of the Silk Roads. And their work really matters for the modern world. Why? Well, I like to think that the Silk Roads was one of the first examples of globalization for good. It was a phenomena which enabled different cultures to swap goods and ideas and arts and languages and trade, and yes, silk too. And what it showed was that when we build bridges across cultures and collide and commingle, we end up being more creative. And quite frankly, that's a lesson we really need to relearn today, because we live in a world where tragically walls are going up all around us. And the idea that cross-cultural collisions or the movement of people and ideas is being demonized, not celebrated. And there's another key point, which is that Silk Roads can also give us a really powerful lens to understand how Russia and China are positioning themselves to the rest of the world and to each other. So today, I'm joined by two key figures who are exploring the Silk Roads and have been reshaping our understanding of them. I've got anthropologist Professor Dame Caroline Humphrey, who was once my intellectual godmother, and historian Professor Peter Frankopan. So welcome to both of you, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you both here. And I'd like to start with you, Peter. Can you start by just telling us very briefly, what is the Silk Road and how can it help us to understand the world today?
I mean, the Silk Roads is generally used by historians and anthropologists as a shorthand for connectivities and exchanges of all kinds. And there's no single road. There's not a sort of particular network of sort of motorways linking China and the Mediterranean. But I think it's a way of capturing the ways in which different cultures, different regions, not just human histories, but all sort of all inclusive about how you can think about how different parts and regions of the world connect. So I suppose your starting point, Gillian, about why is it important today? There are quite a lot of very good specialists who work on Russia. There are slightly fewer who work on Iran, even fewer who work on Central Asia, although we're very unusual to have a Tajik-speaking provost in Cambridge. But how one thinks about what does Central Asia mean internally in the post-Soviet world, what does the connections mean between India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, how do these pieces of the jigsaw fit together? Silk Roads provides quite a good prism to be able to think that it's dangerous to only specialise in one region and area. So, I mean, we're talking here in 2025. If you were to think about where the challenges of today and tomorrow are, and also the opportunities, you probably start at Istanbul and start working eastwards. So Russia and Ukraine, the project of a greater Turkey, the fall of Syria, what's been happening in the Middle East, both in Gaza but also in Iran. Nuclear confrontation this year or very close to nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan. China's rise, what that might mean. I think these pieces of the jigsaw are all on the move. And if you don't pay attention to each of them and to all of them, then I think it's very difficult to understand where we are today. And as it happens, as a historian, of course, I'm going to tell you that you need to understand where all these roots come from in the first place. So I want to go back even further in time to see where we can trace those from.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, just the list of countries you reeled off and their interactions, really puts the region at the center of many geopolitical stories, if not most geopolitical stories today that really matter. And that's been the case for many millennia, hasn't it? Because the Silk Roads initially started when exactly?
Well, I mean, when I wrote my book, I thought we sort of mean about 2,500 years ago, particularly when the sort of first Chinese envoys start to reach out into Central Asia. Now I've spent a bit more time thinking about it. I think that those corridors through which human genetics, crops, diffusions of animals, we go back to the beginning of planetary time. I mean, if we think about the sort of human era going back to about 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, the first dispersals of humans from Africa through into all those parts of the world we think of today as important, the Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, into Yangtze Yellow River, Mekong River deltas, those all go back 50,000 years. The diffusion of rice, for example, from China going westwards, we date from about 8,000 BCE, so about 10,000 years ago. And you start to see that the depth of these corridors through which people and goods and animals and flora and fauna, and of course pathogens, networks, as we know from our computers, don't just spread ideas and abilities to listen to podcasts, but they also can spread malign things. I think that that underpins the whole structure of the kind of biological, natural and human world. So these days, I go back even further. And in fact, when we think about Silk Roads in deep antiquity, you then start to think about why do people start to settle in the regions they do? How do hierarchies, how do ideas about gender start to change? And I think those connections are driving lots of those motors. So, I mean, as a good sort of single example, if you take history as a whole, of the kind of 65 or so really big empires, so states that have been 1 million square kilometers or more, 85% of them have either been born on the steppes or next to the steppes of Eurasia. So those interactions about horses, about ecologies, around manpower, around the hierarchies, around how population densities move and where they form, I think it's the only way I found that can start to really explain big history with the kind of level of detail that scholars require to really think about it. So it's not just broad brushstrokes, but it sort of stands up.
Right. Well, ask a historian and your head starts to spin pretty quickly. And it's not just about Marco Polo, is it? One of the things that's really striking about the Silk Roads is it wasn't just silk that was going back and forth or spices. It was also ideas.
Yes, and those ideas, I suppose you could think of in terms of faith, for example. I mean, the ways in which global religions get forged and spread and compete and borrow. I should let an anthropologist talk about that rather than a historian. But, the ways in which people are trying to connect with ideas about the divine and some of those profound questions that we still think about today about why should we treat people well and what does treating people well mean. Those are questions asked by clever people for thousands of years. And so the collision of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, which arrives in India 2,000 years ago, pretty much, then the rise of Islam, and then different, more modern ideas, communism, Marxism, Leninism. So it's not just about goods and trade; it's about ideas, and then there's institutional ideas about how do you run a good state, what does your bureaucracy look like, how do you pay bureaucrats well, what's the value of a scholar. That's a good question as well today. How do you fund all this stuff? Is it worth having a court of clever people, or should you just have beautiful buildings? Those kinds of ideas about how the sort of collaboration of kings or the competition between states, show that the anthropological ideas and the metrics of how and the matrix of how you look at the world are hugely important. It's not just about economic histories. There's a lot that's going on too.
So, Carrie, as an anthropologist, you are usually focused on the present, not the past. Mm. So what do you make of the fact that so much of the Silk Road study world is about looking back at history, sometimes back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years or more? Is that still relevant to where we are today?
I think it really is. What it does show is that over the Silk Roads, there was all this communication going on, and it was absolutely central to the way these places and kingdoms and so forth worked, that the world does not have to be constructed into opposed blocks. It does not have to be corralled off by very impenetrable borders. And the notion of a kind of peace or justice that can occur over huge, huge areas of many different ethnicities and peoples and different religions, if people open, it is so important. And that was the case for much of the history. And that's what this archaeology is showing too.
That's fascinating because, speaking personally, one thing I've always been very struck by is that everywhere across the Silk Roads, the idea of a nation state doesn't really fit very easily with the way you had this extraordinary ethnic complexity. Instead, you had city-states, which were really mixed up, or cities, which were mixed up with different groups. And then you had these vast steppes with different tribal groups going back and forth. So in some ways, it's a tragedy that the only international group we have that links us today in the world is the United Nations, that puts all the emphasis on the nations. And yet, across this region, we can learn from looking at history that there are other ways to imagine how we organize ourselves.
Absolutely. I mean, as a little sort of anecdote along those lines, if we think about the Great Wall of China, which of course built many, many times, a variety of these walls, and you look at it on the map, it consists of a great crenellated wall with a sort of parapet along the top of it. The way the Mongols think of that wall is not something holding them out, but as a road. Because this is a mountainous area, it's difficult to penetrate those forests and mountains, but you could run along the top of the wall.
Wow. So it's not a wall, it's actually more like, one might even say a bridge to connect people by running along top of it through a road.
Yeah, exactly.
It just goes to show that, in fact, everything you think you know about history gets turned upside down when you actually start looking at it and studying it.
Right.
One of the things I find fascinating about the Silk Roads is that it's a bit like apple pie and motherhood in America, in that no one appears to object to it. Everyone wants to own it. I mean, who do you think, Peter, has the most claim to the Silk Roads today? Or is it really a shared project?
Well, I never like to wash academic laundry in public, but, there are lots of people who are not comfortable about the ideas of Silk Roads and prefer different ways of thinking. I mean, as it happens, I think it's quite a convenient label because silk is a primary commodity and it has lots of different values and uses along these networks. But, there are lots of other ways of roads that are described in sources going back 1,000, in fact 2,000 years, of horse roads, of musk roads, of gold roads, of different kind of commodities. And I'm perfectly comfortable with all of those. But I think that one of the things about the Silk Roads that's interesting is that there's a school in the West today that claims that it's a Western imposition of trying to look at these connections. But if you look at all the Arab writers, the great writers of a millennium or more ago, all of the texts being written are about the books of kings and roads. In Sanskrit literature, it's all about control of roads. So the kind of roads as an infrastructure, I think, is important. When you travel around Central Asia, Pakistan, Gandhara, China too, people are very interested in the fact that the Silk Road prioritizes their own history. And as you know, as also someone who works on Japan, Gillian, that the real driver of the intellectual force behind the sort of the matrix and the ideas about the Silk Roads in the 20th century, from about 1900 onwards, were Japanese scholars. Japanese were very keen to think about how empires without Europeans functioned. So Silk Roads were adopted by peoples across all of Asia, from the Ottoman world through into India too, Central Asia, of course, and China, to think about the ways in which the world spun before Europeans came and colonized. So it's quite an important way of thinking about indigenous histories working outwards, rather than it's a bunch of Western scholars trying to think about clever ways of describing other people.
Well, I find that just absolutely fascinating. And I think most people don't realize the astonishing role that the Japanese played in fostering the rise of the Silk Roads as a concept. I mean, one of the things that I've often loved is that, as someone who's traveled across everywhere between Japan through to Britain and beyond, there are so many words which have traveled back and forth along the Silk Roads over the centuries that link people together without them even realizing it, like the word for tea, which is chai, cha, ocha in Japanese. All along the Silk Roads, these words traveled and link us today. And Carrie, today you're looking primarily at Russian and China interactions along that very long border. Tell us a bit about your work and what you've been doing there.
Well, a project I did was a comparative study of Russia, Mongolia, and China. And I think it's important because when Peter talks about the pendulum swinging back, that relation, the Russia-China one, is very important these days in the geopolitical arena. And so I had this idea of looking at the effects on the environment and ecology of the way that the Russian, the Mongolian, and the Chinese economies worked. And if you look at the broad inner Asian region, it consists of a huge steppe. It's a great grassland. You could take it as a common ground.
And of course, people know about the steppes because of Genghis Khan and all those movies of them, cantering across the steppes with their horses and things.
Absolutely. It's a great grassland. And so what effect on that environment did these three countries have? We did a big study with around 20 people dotted around the region, asking the same questions in every place. And we looked at remotely sensed material, climate data, and all that kind of thing. And the results were very, very clear. The Mongols, where both the livestock and the people are moving around continuously, did far the best in relation to the environment. In China, people had concentrated into little towns and cities, and you got little points where the damage was very severe, but the rest was not too bad. And in Russia, it came out worst, really, because the entire system, including every bit of agriculture and herding and all that, had been industrialized, and huge areas of fragile grassland were ploughed up for fodder and commercial crops. And the results of that research, we published them in articles and books. And it's interesting that actually I think they did in some ways have an effect, because people in China and also to some extent in Russia translated the book, and there are signs that they took on board this notion that you need to avoid overgrazing, to avoid desertification and so on, you need to sort of move people and things around. And they started doing that.
That's amazing. So some of the work and research you've been doing has actually been translated along the Silk Roads.
Yeah.
And so we're not just exchanging silk, we're exchanging books and ideas in a way that can actually help us all think about the environment much more effectively.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. So one of the things that is really important in the geopolitical world today is relations between Russia and China. And there is this extraordinarily long border between these two big countries, which very few people know much about, but as you've written, really matters. Tell us a bit about that border and why we should be paying a lot more attention to it.
Well, the story I want to tell about it, because I had another project on that border, again with another large international team of people who were situated along it. The story really is that building bridges between Russia and China, anyway, is not very easy, and it doesn't work very well top down. So we had this study along the border, and we were really wanting to find out what that border can tell us about the possibility of longer, deeper collaboration between these two countries. Because we know, of course, that Putin and Xi Jinping have a nice and cozy diplomatic relation. And
well, so they like to tell us whenever they appear on television to really irritate all the G7 leaders.
Indeed they do. And they do have sort of military cooperation too. But what we found out that the two countries are so radically different from top to bottom, the way they're organized, that this really becomes difficult. Russia is highly centralized and organized like the spokes of a wheel, all centered on Moscow. And the result is that at the edges, in places like these borders, you get these huge underpopulated or even completely blank areas without roads, without people, destitute villages and so on. And Putin's policy is not to develop them. He is going for, instead, a few showcase kind of spots where he's doing development, like the Eastern Cosmodrome or the Gazprom terminal, that kind of thing. Xi, on the other hand, has a completely different picture of consistent development right across the whole territory, from place to place, a much more networked picture of the country, super connected by road, rail, and air. And the idea of raising the prosperity of the whole population so you don't have these kind of gaps. And so what this means is that in Russia, it's still very easy to have kind of Soviet-era kind of closed zones, cities that are kind of secret. Their names don't appear on maps. You can't go there without special permission. They're designed for development of security technology and so on, or these isolated penal camps they have. And in Russia, the border areas are much more open in a way. Although the whole country is under surveillance, it's not got these pockets of sort of total closure. So it's a very patchy situation in Russia.
Fascinating. I mean, have you physically been along that border?
Yes.
Can you actually
yes.
get to it?
Yes. And well, not all of it, no.
Right.
Because the thing is that crossing it, there are only 2 or 3 places you can cross. And here I come to the bridges, which is
tell us about, because you were looking, there's a particular island, isn't there, that's incredibly symbolic.
Oh, yes.
In a river somewhere. I'm not sure I could point to it on a map, but somewhere out there.
Well, the great river that separates them is called Amur, or Heilongjiang in Chinese, and it has an island in the middle of it, and they've agreed to share this island. So half of it is part of Russia, half of it is part of China. And the fact is you can't go from one half to the other half. There's a strict border there. And what they've done with the 2 halves of the island is very, very characteristic. On the Russian side, it consists of ruins and a tiny little chapel, Orthodox chapel. On the Chinese side, they've developed it into a tourist sort of area, and they've got walkways and kind of pagodas and roads and that sort of thing.
It sounds like a gigantic social geopolitical experiment where you have the 2 different parts of the island. You can go from, it sounds absolutely fascinating.
Well, you can't go from one to the other.
Peter, have you been there ever? Do you know about the island?
Yeah, and it's an anthropologist's dream. So, I shouldn't really be chipping in with two anthropologists on the call. But, of course, the fact that they're so different is why the Russians and the Chinese keep making press statements about how much they love each other and how they're going to have eternal friendships, because they're not natural bedfellows. And, in fact, because I'm involved in occasional, in policy discussions and so on, quite often you'll get very high-ranking Chinese who say, please don't believe that just because we say it that we mean it. And that's one of the first things you learn as a social anthropologist at Cambridge, which is intention. And we learn that as historians, that audience and reception are really important. But one of the problems in this region is that the Russian Far East has a population of 10 million people, and in Heilongjiang and Liaoning and Jilin province combined population, it's 110 million. So if you stand on this island, apart from the fact that one side looks like it's having money spent on it, there are just a lot of people who look like they might want a bit more space one day, and then a lot of people who've got quite a lot of space that's available that, as it happened, used to be governed from under the Qing dynasty from Beijing. So there's a lot of tension in this relationship. And, when you go to the borderlands, as Carrie's written about so fantastically, the world looks like it's not quite so simple as policy by PowerPoint, where, Xi Jinping and Putin they do actually like the same vanilla flavor ice cream from the Soviet era that they keep giving each other as a present. But that's not enough to explain global geopolitics. The stuff on the ground really does matter.
So it's not just about ping pong diplomacy, it's about ice cream diplomacy.
But the key thing is, I think, as Peter briefly mentioned, is that a huge chunk of that far eastern part of Russia, what's now Russia, used to be part of China until fairly recently.
So there's a lot of defensiveness there.
Until 1860, it was part of China. And the Chinese have not forgotten this, and nor of the Chinese population. So if you look on the Chinese internet, there are people always saying, well, we want that back at some point.
Well, it's a bit like, because people, of course, focus in the West on the fact that, what's going to happen in the future to countries like Taiwan or to parts of the Japanese island chain. But they don't ever look west, do they, as to the potential flashpoints there as well. But do you think that, by the way, have you been to both sides of the island?
No, I haven't.
Right, okay, that's going to be a lifelong dream. We've got to make sure at some point soon we'd go there with you with a camera and recording equipment to actually hear about what it's actually like on the ground. So in terms of, what it means to look at this part of the world, is there a need for more research into this kind of area along the Russian-Chinese border?
I think there is, because I think things are changing there quite a lot. And there, as Peter said, people are not very open, really, about what's happening there, and it's difficult to find out. And so I do think one needs more research. For example, we don't know how many Chinese people are actually working inside Russia, not to speak of the North Koreans. I think large numbers of them are drafted in too, because the place is underpopulated. The Russians themselves are leaving the Far East because it's an uncomfortable place to live, and if they can go live somewhere near Moscow, they'd much prefer that. And Chinese and to some extent North Koreans are moving in, but not necessarily permanently.
Wow, gosh.
So because the Chinese don't like living there either. But
it doesn't sound very attractive, I must say. When I was living in Tajikistan many years ago, doing my research as an anthropologist, with you as one of my supervisors, I was stunned that there were Koreans in the bazaars there who were selling Korean goods. You could buy kimchi in Samarkand and Dushanbe. And the fact that people have been moving back and forth and still moving is something that most people just don't realize at all, do they?
No, that's really important thing about the way the Soviet Union worked, that it was a kind of cauldron of dislocation of people on many, many occasions, whether this were prisoners of war or people judged to have collaborated with the Germans or whatever it was, or the Koreans who they thought were a bit dubious because they might flee off to China. They moved them wholesale to Central Asia, which is what you found. And so actually, one of the things that's quite interesting now is that the far east of Russia is full of Ukrainians who were moved out of Ukraine in one of these campaigns. And now these people who are Ukrainian find themselves drafted into the army to go and fight where? But in Ukraine. I mean, there are these paradoxical things happening.
Wow, and there's just so many stories to tell. Now, one of the things that the Silk Road Studies Group does at King's is to bring scholars from all along the different parts of the Silk Roads. We really do have an extraordinary mix or cauldron of different scholars come from different areas. Now, we have to be honest about this, is that many of these countries obviously have all kinds of different political regimes, and it's not easy for them necessarily to write or talk to each other always about this extraordinary history. And yet we're finding that here in King's, we're acting almost like a mini intellectual bazaar or a form of sort of, academic Samarkand or Bukhara ourselves, aren't we? Where people can actually meet together again and talk freely about ideas.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right, Gillian. And it is an aim of our program and why we need to develop it and make sure that we have funding in it that can bring people over, because characteristically it's not easy for them to come and stay in a place like Cambridge. And I'd point out that the program in King's is kind of a node in a much wider network in Cambridge as a whole, the university, which has other parts, Far Eastern studies, Mongolian studies and whatnot, anthropology, where similarly people are on programs that invite them here. And so when somebody, let's say from Uzbekistan, comes to King's, they not only meet the people in King's, but they can meet a whole wide range of people throughout the university, and it's very wonderful for them, or it should be anyway.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I say that Cambridge sometimes looks like a bit like an intellectual bazaar, because from the outside, it's completely fragmented and chaotic. And frankly, I barely even begun to scratch the surface of all the things that are going on here. And yet, precisely because it's a bit fragmented and chaotic and let a thousand flowers bloom everywhere, there's so many different parts that can interact and collide and unexpectedly produce some amazing alchemy. I sometimes think that Cambridge is a bit like a sort of tapestry woven out of lots of different intellectual strands or threads gathered from all over the place. And of course, one of those places, we're also trying to break down, different walls between different academic institutions. I mean, Peter, you have a foot both in Oxford and Cambridge, don't you?
Yes, I mean, and I would just back to what you were saying about the intellectual bazaar, Gillian. I think it's that what is so fantastic about the Silk Roads is because the scope of geographies and periods is so vast, you're kept on your toes. So the research fellows we've got, we talked about the Mongols and Genghis Khan. We got Angus Russell, who's working on the ways in which Mongol influences in Russia helped shape the early Russian state before the rise of Ivan the Terrible, but how networks of communication worked in the Mongol world that has not, it doesn't have to have connectivity to today, but as it happens, it does. We've got Katie Campbell, who works on oases in particularly in Otrar in Western Kazakhstan, where the work that she's doing lets us see how climate change played such an important role in depopulation of urban centres 1,000 years ago that helps explain conquest patterns again in the past. We've got Francesco Banchini, who works on the transmission of medical knowledge across through Southeast Asia, but about how ideas about treatment, about medicine, about patronage of healthcare worked in the past, and those have huge resonances with every department there is in Cambridge. So we've got Anu Janayev, who's working on sort of how cities in Mongolia, in his particular case, Bazalhot, to work on about how these are kind of cosmopolitan centres on their own. So because we all gather for our weekly seminars, you never know what you're never a specialist in what the person coming to talk on is, but it makes you expand your views and your horizons, and I think that's a really important part of what, not just what the programme does or what King's does, but what Cambridge does to sort of to keep on stretching, because we sometimes think of education as something you do as an undergraduate and as a PhD, but education is about how you keep learning. And I've learned, listening to Carrie over the years, I've learned far more than I have done left to my own devices, because people pepper you with ideas that it's like being hit by protons in a sort of collider. So it's fantastic to have a chance to be hearing the latest research. And, we try to bring in people from different backgrounds, different countries, but that outreach that King's does about joining up other parts of the world, it is really important, because, as you mentioned, lots of parts of the world we work on are not as free as we are, and the connections between academics and the ways in which we can talk safely about the past opens doors that can allow lots of other correspondence and collaboration to flow through. So it's hugely important, I think, just beyond just the pure academics too.
But it certainly shows, and one of the things I find fascinating going to the Silk Road seminars at King's is that I just think about the Mongols in terms of Genghis Khan. And there's so much more to the Mongols. I mean, I never knew until we had a visiting researcher recently that the Mongols built these square cities along the steppes, which are extraordinary and completely contradicts everything I always thought about them. It just goes to show you're never too old to learn new things. One of the things that's interesting that's come out of your research, Carrie, is looking at Russia afresh through the lens of colonization. And that's an issue which is very dear to my heart, because my own PhD was in Soviet Tajikistan, and I was looking at how the Tajiks imagined themselves as being both Muslim and part of the then Soviet system, and whether that created a clash or not. And so I've looked a lot at the question of Russian imperialism, which is sadly, tragically alive and well today. But tell us a bit about how this study has impacted your vision of how Russia works today.
Well, that is a very interesting question, because, of course, when I first went to Russia, it was the Soviet Union, and all Soviet citizens of whatever ethnicity were taught to think we are all equal Soviet citizens. There's no colonialism, that belongs only to those imperial countries like Britain and France and so forth. We don't have it. That has changed, though, and people are now thinking, what is it? Why is it that we are sort of not doing so well as those other people? Why are more of our soldiers recruited in to fight in Ukraine than people who live near Moscow? That kind of thing.
And the people who are asking that are the non-Russian groups, aren't they? The ones who aren't in Moscow, but in the Far East and all these parts that people don't know about.
Exactly, the people in the Far East and so on. So that, I think, is a gradual thing. And there are a lot of people who resist it and still say, no, we are absolute loyal citizens. We're totally patriotic and so on. And that's, of course, encouraged by the way Russia works at the moment. I don't know.
And these people are like, Buryat, Kalmuk, Sakha, all these groups who most people have never heard of, who are in many ways are different indigenous groups across the Far East.
They are. They look different, and their customs are different, their religions are different. But the way Putin is trying to bring all this together is a classic sort of kingly or even imperial mode, which is by donating personally to individual people and creating competitions. So who can write the most patriotic essay? Who is going to compose the ballet that most tells us about how we should react to the war in Ukraine, all of that. And so individual people are picked out for their patriotism and related to the centre by being given prizes. And it's a kind of wholesale thing right through, amazingly, through the country. But against that, there are other people who are saying, hold on a minute, what is this kind of thing? And what about our position? And one of the things, of course, that's happened is that with the war in Ukraine, some people have fled. A whole generation of young men fled from far east of Russia into Mongolia because it was the nearest country. They couldn't really go to China. China still would sufficiently back Russia not to accept those people, but these emigres went to Mongolia.
So you've got the beginning of a sort of anti-imperialist sentiment bubbling across the region. Yes. I must say, I noticed this because I saw 3 or 4 years ago that Kazakhstan and Kazakhs began to spell their names with a Q instead of a KH as a small form of rebellion.
Yes.
And one of the big geopolitical questions in the future is, how is this going to develop? Because we all know that culture isn't static. It's constantly changing and moving like a river as new streams come in. And this could end up being incredibly important more widely, couldn't it?
It could, yes. I don't see anything changing massively in the immediate future, but you never know how these things might work out.
I think those narratives, they really matter. I mean, one of the reasons why the Kazakhs have changed is that alphabetization is because they're trying to create distance with Russia and from China. And so playing towards the Turkic world is a kind of natural sort of counterbalance. So, those narratives, they really do matter. I mean, Putin and Lavrov talk a lot about how the West have put people in chains and enslaved and been imperialists, but that Russians are not empire builders and they haven't conquered and exploited people. And, you don't need to step too far away from Moscow and you don't need to get as far as Central Asia to realize that's not the case. And, the ways in which Russia has treated its minorities, it's a hugely live issue across Central Asia at the moment. I mean, a country like Tajikistan, you mentioned Dushanbe, Gillian, I was there last month. At the moment, still about 50% of Tajikistan's GDP comes from Tajiks remitting money from abroad, particularly from Russia, where minorities are treated extremely badly in most big cities. So, these questions about empire, about colonization, about the right to be able to have a seat at the UN and to shape global politics, those competing narratives are really important to be digging into and investigating. And the worlds that we all work on along the Silk Roads it's like a treasure trove. So, you mentioned Korea, Gillian, earlier. Central Asia is filled with Koreans and with Korean restaurants because Koreans fled from the expanding Japanese empire in the start of the 20th century and started to move into Russia as a result, including some of the intellectuals who were pushing the idea of Korean independence. And then Stalin deported them all into Central Asia in 1937. And so you find Koreans, and it's huge numbers, direct flights to Seoul from Almaty, every day. And perhaps not surprisingly, Central Asia is one of the regions where South Korea's investment program and development programs are most active in the world. So Japan's interests in Central Asia and in the Silk Road, South Korea's interests, we don't think about them, but these are kind of multi-billion-dollar entities of what do children learn at school, what should they eat, what should they learn about other people's histories. And it is absolutely... it's riveting. I don't know how we don't spend... Well, everybody should be trying to be doing the Silk Roads program. But, there's so much that we can be looking at that has not just resonance today, but is a fascinating interest in the past too.
Why do you think it's so important today to really uphold the Silk Roads in terms of reinforcing the idea that there's more that binds us together than actually separates us?
Well, okay, I'll give you 3 reasons. One is the dignity of other people's histories. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, you did European history or the history of the West. And that doesn't mean Europe, actually. We don't know anything about Eastern Europe or Central Europe. Austria maybe fits in some history curricula, but, you don't specialise in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the history of Finland if you study history at Cambridge. And there was one paper in my last year, it was called The West and the Rest. And that's very much how people think about the financial markets that you know so well, Gillian. It's kind of emerging markets means everywhere that's not a G7 country and has people who don't look quite like us. So I think it's quite important to remember that there are other people in the world and understanding their stories, who they are, where they come from. So that's a point of view of academic honesty. I think that's one. Second, 75% of the world's population live on that line east of Istanbul. So if you're interested in climate change or pollution or maternal health care or urbanization, take your pick. Microchip processors, those are the makers, those are the buyers, those are the markets of the future because, the weight of numbers really matters. And I think we have switched off about that. And then third, of course, those geopolitical fault lines. We're living in an age where state-on-state violence is on the move again. And the ambitions of peoples across all of Asia are rising because the pendulum of geopolitical and geoeconomic weight is swinging back in their direction. And that can raise expectations, that can create fractures. So, like I said in my Silk Roads books, I've just got a 10th anniversary edition coming out. It probably matters more, the calculations made in Delhi, in Beijing, in Tehran, in Jakarta. Those decisions, I think, matter more than ones being made in Lisbon or Brussels or Helsinki. And it's not either or. Those decisions in Europe do matter as well. But I think that's the swing of history is taking us back to these, not just land routes, by the way. Silk Roads, also the maritime connections are hugely important. That world we're in the process of a new world order being forged. So understanding why that's happening and what might happen next, I think everybody would be interested in.
Well, I must say, I'm very impressed we've gone through the whole discussion without mentioning the word great game. But what's clear from this is that there's numerous great games happening, and it wasn't just a 19th century concept. I mean, as you said, Carrie, there's all these great games happening today.
Yep.
The great game, though, is something that means a lot to Brits, because we had lots of officers beheaded in Bukhara and it felt like it was about protecting India and so on. You don't find any references to not just the word great game, but to the kind of concept in Russia. In the Russian histories of the 19th century, there's not the same sense that this is an area of competition and of expansion and a push through that somehow Moscow will take over Delhi one day. But, I think you are absolutely right, Gillian. In today's world, competition over network control, over fossil fuels, over critical minerals, over political narratives, that shape of competition is acute. And, you know that better than anybody. Where that all leads us, we probably should spend a bit more time thinking about, because we're used, I think, in the UK and in Europe to thinking that the world is a gentle, kind place. And we forget that that's because we're reaping the benefits of 300 years of empire. And it's taken a while for us to realize that perhaps we're now on the menu rather than one of the predators. But that's the rich cycle, and the wheel of history keeps turning. But so understanding where we are in that is probably quite useful.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful explanation of why we are all so passionate about the Silk Roads Studies Group and why we think it actually could help to not just shed light on the past and this extraordinary complex history, but also help build a bit more understanding for the future. That really is our goal. So let me just finish by saying thank you so much to Carrie. Thank you so much, Peter, for your thoughts. It's been a really fascinating discussion. And thank you to all of the people who are involved in supporting the Silk Roads Group and doing the research. And let's keep discovering more collisions and connections and discovering why the Silk Roads is about so much more than silk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.